Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Bret. We're on the internet on YouTube, and hopefully you're watching this live so you can ask questions and be a part of the chat and the community that we're building here. In case you didn't know, if this is your first time, I'm live every Thursday, usually, and I usually have a guest, and we get to talk about container stuff, DevOps stuff. We talk about Docker, Kubernetes, all those things, all the tools, and the cloud a lot. So stay tuned on Thursdays. Come up and ask your best questions for our guests, and we'll dive into stuff. Usually we have demos and cool stuff like that. All right, before we get to the guests and the show, I want to give you a couple of announcements. One, I'm green today just because my favorite cartoon is coming back on, Rick and Morty. I'm actually wearing my Pickle Rick shirt. So if you're a fan of Rick and Morty, that's why I'm green today, because we've got like 3 days left till the rest of the season starts. And now that we're all quarantined at home, the most important thing is watching TV. Next thing, we have coming up DockerCon in about a month, actually, a little less than a month. And if you've been around, you've heard me talk about it. DockerCon is going to be this, what I hope is a really great online event. And I know right now we've got live events every week. So it's there's lots of companies having their live events, and it's great to have all this content. One of the things we're trying to do for DockerCon is we're going to have at least 3 to 4 streams simultaneously happening all at once. So we're going to be having different types of streams, and I get to host one of the streams. So what we're going to be doing all day is focusing on essentially helping you in chat. So one of the cool things all day is we'll be like a container help desk where we're going to be talking Docker and Kubernetes, all the tooling, and taking questions from the audience. I'm going to have guests all day long, and we'll just be talking with you in chat, trying to figure stuff out, helping you solve your problems, talking about topics like today's backup topic. So we'll be doing that, as well as a whole bunch of presenters, I think at least 40 presenters. And then we'll have a separate channel just for theCUBE, who is a great outfit that's normally at physical conferences doing interviews. And they're the pros. They have the pro studio, the pro setup, and the great team there. And they're going to be doing their own thing all day long. So show up. You can register at dockercon.com. I make no money off of this. I just want you to come and learn some stuff and have fun. So please do that. All right, last thing is this show, as well as the podcast that comes from it and everything else, is all now sponsored by my Patreon page. So if you want to see more stuff like this, you can buy me a coffee at patreon.com/Bret Fisher. All the stuff's down below in the description. Enough of that. All right, let's get to the show. So my guest today, which we've been talking about this for months, planning this with the team at VMware, Nolan from VMware. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And what is your Twitter handle? I just realized. What is that? What does that mean?
That's Palin Day. Something I came up with in middle school. It's made up. I think I got it from a Dragonlance novel. Took a character name and changed it. Don't really talk about work stuff there, but if you want to follow me, you can.
Right.
Be prepared not to see a whole lot of Docker or Kubernetes stuff, but yeah, you're certainly welcome to follow me.
Yeah, so I always appreciate having fellow gamers on the show. I just finished Doom Eternal and stayed up way too late the last month killing that game, and I almost threw my controller a few times because it's hard.
Yeah, I haven't gotten into Doom Eternal. What I've lately been playing has been Dragon Quest XI on the Switch, but that's gonna take me a while at the rate I've been playing it, since it's like over 100 hours. So
wow,
yeah, it's gonna take me a long time to get through that.
That's commitment. Yeah, that's more than a few charges on your Nintendo.
On Switch,
so.
Yeah. I'm prepared for that to be like a year-long thing, if not more. So
right. Well, cool. Oh, by the way, for those asking or wondering, I didn't know. I had to ask if that was Metroid related in the background, and indeed, that poster is from Super Metroid, right? That's a
Yep. That's a Super Metroid thing off of. That was a fan art poster that I got for Christmas one year.
Yeah, nice. So we don't normally talk about games in this show, but I just thought I had to mention it because we're going to be staring at it the whole show.
Yep.
My gamer handle is Sonic Bum, and it didn't make much sense on the internet, so I had to end up changing it to my real name because I realized nobody would find me. Mostly because I was into Sonic the Hedgehog in the 90s, and Sonic Boom was taken and Sonic was taken, so I made up Sonic Bum. But that is old news. You can still find some remnants of that stuff around if someone was trying to hunt me down. All All right, so let's talk about Kubernetes and backups because that's why you're here. But also, it's
Yeah.
a topic that doesn't get a lot of talk. And but first, let's talk about like how did you get started at VMware and like what's your background?
Yeah. So I came to VMware via Heptio. I started at Heptio working on uh, Velero, which was Heptio Arc. It got renamed as part of the acquisition. The project started one day at Heptio when Joe Beta was trying to work with some clusters and realized he had some EBS volumes that he's like, hey, I need. What if? Wouldn't it be great if something snapshotted these volumes automatically? Um, so I came from before that I was at Rackspace working on a project called OpenStack Ansible that deployed the OpenStack control plane with Ansible in not Docker containers, but LXC containers. So it was taking the control plane and instead of like deploying a ton of hardware, it was condensing that into containers. So yeah, I went from that to working at Heptio and trying to make this whole Kubernetes thing work out, and work that bet paid off.
Yeah, really cool. And so so Velero is now the new product name. In fact, let me just bring it up so people can see the site.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and Velero.io,
Mm-hmm.
and they can find out all the good stuff about this here. And typically, like if we're going to talk about backups, typically backups are a boring conversation, right?
Hopefully,
Like,
yeah.
yeah, like it's not, and a lot of us think we have it handled. I mean, it's funny that it's not like when I usually work on like container projects and stuff like that. Backups are they're almost pushed to the point of like they just assume that they're happening. Like everyone
Mm-hmm.
just assumes that somebody did it and that they're automatic and like they're always right and that we've got everything we need to restore. Oh, and that we've tested restores and that we know how
Right.
to do DR and that we've validated our DR on a regular basis. And almost never is any of that true.
Right.
And how do we fix this? Like,
Yeah. Well, in a lot of, I think in like a cloud native world, a lot of people assume that your vendors handle it, right?
right,
Like, so you're running on a public cloud, doesn't matter who it is, and you assume, well, they've handled all that hard stuff, right? You assume that your volumes are they're durable, they're resistant to um, availability zones falling down, things like that.
right,
And maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Maybe US East goes away, and you want to get back more quickly than those engineers can. Or maybe there's some applications that are not made to be cloud native. They're not designed yet to be living in that world. So it's all well and good if you have a stateless application, but if you've got data, you really should be owning that backup strategy.
yeah,
And rather than just assuming your cloud provider has taken care of all of it, you need to make sure you're protected. Um, so Velero allows you to not. It does two things. It backs up the Kubernetes metadata, so like the YAML or JSON manifests, and it also grabs your persistent volumes, and that's probably the bigger thing because you could get the Kubernetes manifests through GitOps, right? If you're following that strategy. So if you want to grab your Kubernetes application data, Velero provides a way to get that.
yeah,
Um, there's a couple of different ways we can do that. We've got support for doing snapshots through your persistent volume provider or using an application called Rustic to get file system level. And that makes it platform neutral. So
right.
you can move from one provider to another. Um, but yeah, like you said, we assume all this stuff's being done, but really someone in your organization should probably be owning that for your application.
Right. I think a lot of people who don't really know cloud and Kubernetes well, um, would probably think that backups are either built in or it's a checkbox type of thing because we would at this point it's like Kubernetes and Docker and the container world we've felt like we've got this method for easily deploying, and so now we're rapidly deploying, and we're even able to allow people to create new apps and deploy them without much effort in terms of the getting the operations team to be up, this big manual effort to say, oh, you got a new app. Well, it's going to take us a month to get that into production. But having that experience where maybe the Kubernetes YAML has something in it, or that basically says, yep, this is the part you need to back up, and that's all I need to know. And are we to the point with this project where in my KubeYAML as a developer, I can specify what needs to be backed up or somehow label it or something so that it can be an automatic effort where the ops team doesn't then have to figure out how to back up that thing after it's already on my server? Is it that kind of level?
We've talked about that so that you could package in your application to say, that the application could tell Velero, this is what you need. Velero's not to that level yet. The way Velero works is that Velero has a command line and it runs as a deployment in your server or in your cluster.
Yeah.
And the Velero operates by creating its own backup CRs and then goes and runs a controller or operator to make the backup happen. And that backup CR says, okay, what do you want to back up? Is it everything in a namespace? Is it everything matching this label? Is it everything except for these things? So you can do excludes. So everything not matching this label, everything but this type of resource. So maybe you don't want to include cluster roles as an example.
Right.
We're engaging with groups upstream. There's a relatively new, I think it was formed, I'm trying to remember exact timelines, but there's a new working group upstream, the data protection working group, which is a collaboration between SIG apps and SIG storage that's trying to figure out ways to standardize how applications can communicate what would need to be backed up. So what's what's in this application? Is it a deployment? Is it a stateful set? What are the components of this application? And also, what are the building blocks for protecting it? Does it have volumes that need to be snapshotted? Does it have other external resources that we need to grab? So we're not only working on it within a Velero context, we're trying to work with the upstream community so that there's standards here. So it's not just us. But yeah, in terms of having something that the application developers define, we're not there yet, but we want to get there.
Right. Because not having any experience with this product, so I'm coming into it as a new user.
Sure.
I'm thinking, okay, if I'm trying to move my tooling to a more automated fashion, I mean, I'm this is my year of GitOpsing all the things, at least in my personal projects. And so I imagine like, okay, I've got a new app. I'm going to host it in my cluster. I'm going to be putting those manifests or those Helm charts or something in my Git repo. And how can I just add that, like you said, a custom resource that specifies, hey, these things in my deployment also need to be backed up, or maybe an annotation or a label or something that you're talking about in the existing resources. And that's to me, I mean, like us as like if you're a dedicated backup person, you want that command line, right? That makes total sense. You want to be able to control the cluster as a whole, and you want to be able to see all the backups and how all those resources. And so that's awesome. I'm always trying to shift that responsibility to the team that's owning the app, and of course, with varying levels of success. But that did seem like a thing that would be super helpful, is to say, hey, if you all just want to take care of it and don't even involve us, like we'll just put these things in your YAML, your Helm chart, or whatever you're creating, and then just know that we're going to be backing that up, and it'll
Yeah.
work or whatever.
So the way I would probably pitch that to an application team is there's we have what are called schedules, and that's basically it takes the same set of includes and exclude fields that a backup does, and it runs it automatically on some schedule. So say you've got a Helm chart for your application, you could include the schedule as part of that. So it's not quite to the level that, so we've got like open issues for, I think we've called them backup templates
Yeah.
that applications could define. Um, but if you include a Velero schedule in your YAML, you could apply that, and it could say include the whatever label the application developers define. So they could say, okay, this is the label we use. This is the schedule we use. These are the hooks we define to back up the database. So we don't have anything in Velero to directly dump databases. We instead define hooks that say, run this command on my container and get the stuff dumped out of the database into a persistent volume. So that's probably how I would approach it in the current state. Is have application developers use a schedule, or at least define a backup CR in their Helm chart, and from there, that can be invoked on a schedule, and then the cluster administrator would be responsible for getting Velero installed.
Right. Did you? What can you send things to sort of cloud storage? Like I want to put it in this S3 bucket or in this, whatever digital. Are those like what you call those drivers or plugins or?
Yep, those are plugins.
Yeah.
So Velero has a plugin model for. There's there's four main types of plugins. There's two of them are kind of grouped together. They're item action plugins, which happen on backup and restore. So they can modify Kubernetes manifests as they come in and out of the cluster. So on backup, you can modify Kubernetes manifests.
Okay.
So we use that to walk from a pod to a PVC to a PV. So like when you're backing up a pod, we assume if it's got any PVCs, you want the PVs. And then we've got restore item actions that manipulate stuff on restore. Kind of doing the reverse as an example. You go from a PV to rebuild back to the pod. Then we have object storage plugins, which hook up to S3, GCP, object storage, Azure blob storage. And there's third-party plugins for that too. Those three cover the main object storage cases. Right. And then we have volume snapshotter plugins. So those do EBS snapshotting, GCP volume snapshotting. We have a vSphere snapshotter plugin now. There's been community interest.
So at a disk level, at a volume mount level, yeah. Not so much an application level, yeah.
No, those are not at an application level currently.
Yeah. So is it using CSI in the background? Like, is that how are you able to? Do these plugins for storage have to be separate from a CSI plugin? Is this somehow related or?
Right now they're separate. Velero actually predates CSI.
Okay.
So our 1.4 release, which we're hoping to get out in a couple weeks, actually that's our main feature is getting CSI integration.
Yeah.
At a beta level. So that's something myself and Ashish are working on. Ashish, another engineer on our team, and we're working with the CSI community to make sure we're working with the Kubernetes CSI integration there.
Right.
So yeah, our hope is eventually we deprecate the Velero plugins for snapshotting, but that's going to be a long-term goal.
Sure.
For the foreseeable future, we're going to have both.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's the same thing that the Kubernetes community is doing, right? Like obviously the built-in plugins are going to be there for a while, and like the CSI is not necessarily feature complete in comparison. Yeah, so I can see how that's a multi-year process, right? And you
Right,
don't want to
right,
leave
and
anyone
not
behind,
every
right? You don't want to leave someone behind just because they're still using the old backup that works. Yeah, so that's
right, and like not every CSI driver has the snapshotting capability yet. So,
right.
and the snapshotting, even though CSI itself is GA, the snapshotting API is still beta. So Velero itself is probably going to trail behind on the GA status. Just so we can see as more drivers become available, we're testing it out with the drivers that are there, but it's requiring some tweaks to Velero, and we want to make sure we don't break existing Velero users, and we also want to make sure like we're being good community participants
Yeah,
and helping inform the design.
yeah, that makes sense. I mean, certainly, if people aren't used to defaulting to CSI for their regular apps, then not using that. By the way, CSI, sorry, people,
Oh yeah, yeah, it's fine.
container storage interface. Yeah, it's the standard that Kubernetes is now using for new plugins to use different storage other than just local disk. So if you're using a cloud storage, you can either choose the built-in ones, but now the new way to do it lately is the CSI plugins, right? So
Right.
and the idea us for all of this, right, is that every storage vendor can make their own CSI plugin. This is even on the roadmap now for Docker Swarm for it to adopt a CSI as sort of a standard mechanism for storage, so that we maybe have the dream someday is that the entire container industry can rely on a single volume plugin for each type of volume, whether that's a cloud storage or your VMware storage or
Yep.
your NetApp iSCSI storage or whatever it is, right? Like you can
Yep.
just rely on that one driver, and it provides all the mechanisms for all these different types of tools, and you don't have to learn us that so that each one of your products doesn't have a different way of connecting to storage, which
Yep.
I kind of thought we solved like 15 years ago with iSCSI. I felt like that was the dream, and then the
Yep.
cloud happened, and then containers happened, and yeah, we're back to trying to figure it all out again. So
Yep. Yep. And on the
darn it.
Valero team, yeah, we saw that and we're like, well, we saw the CSI stuff happening and we're like, well, it doesn't make any sense to ask storage vendors to make Valero specific
Right,
plugins, especially
right,
like if there's competing backup solutions. It doesn't make any
yeah,
sense to ask storage vendors to make a bunch of different ones.
right.
So
And there always
if
is,
CS,
right? There's a ton of
yeah,
competing. Yeah,
right. So if there's this community standard, let's get involved there. Let's make sure it
yeah,
works for everybody and hook into that. So um, yeah,
yeah, for sure.
it makes absolute sense to make Valero compatible with that. But yeah, when Valero started CSI, the discussion for CSI hadn't really started.
Yeah, and even Docker struggled with this because
Yep.
they provided Docker plugins for storage, but this is pre CSI, and so now Docker's wanting to also consider the CSI as a mechanism so that because storage vendors don't want to do this. They don't want to make a Kubernetes plugin and a Docker plugin and a backup every vendor plugin.
Yep.
And of course, trying to make them all one is way harder than we all probably think it is.
Yep.
So, yeah, it'll get there someday, maybe. I have some friends that are very skeptical that this is ever going to come to fruition.
It's
The
it's
dream of storage.
it's not easy, and I'm glad that from my perspective, I'm just calling storage. I'm not an implementer.
Right.
That the stateful stuff's hard. Stateful stuff is definitely hard.
Yeah.
Um,
And
but it
snapshotting and like
Yep.
snapshotting is crazy voodoo that sometimes I don't even understand really how it's happening.
Yep.
Um, especially when
Yep.
the apps are aware of this of the snapshot and they actually write to disk before snapshotting. Like that stuff gets super nerdy. We could talk
Yep.
about that all day. But
Right.
I do want to get to demos because
Sure.
you prepared demos and we all love a good demo here on YouTube where we could watch. So
Sure.
um, let me know when you got your screen shared and I will.
Yeah. I've got it shared. I'll switch over to Firefox so you don't see yourself. So I am in my browser.
Yeah.
All right. So I've just got a very simple WordPress and MySQL application running. So I just want to show that this is up and running. I've got some data in it. Hopefully this is big enough for people to read. I've got a post. Sorry, bumping my microphone there. I can go into the post. I've got a comment, and just show that like I'm not restoring any other weird data. Live comment. I'm not doing any. I'm going to take an actual backup. So got some small data, and then I'm going to jump over here to my terminal. So I just want to show I've got Velero running in my namespace. And right now I just got one replica. And because I'm not great at talking and typing, I'm just going to run this demo script, which is going to run commands and proceed when I hit buttons. So I've got this WordPress namespace. It's just got one pod each for WordPress and MySQL. And they've got services to expose them, just one to go to the outside world for WordPress. And we've also got PVCs. So we've got one for MySQL. We've got one for WordPress. That's just for like static assets, pictures, things like that.
Uploads. Yeah.
Uploads, CSS. And just to prove there are indeed persistent volumes. This is the MySQL claim that matches to this one. To that.
All right.
Okay. Now I'm going to show this is the latest version of Velero. Got 1.3.2 on the server and 1.3.2 running on my laptop.
Sorry, let me back up for a second. So before this, you deployed the custom resource definitions, and then you deployed a controller, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So there's a controller running in your cluster, and this works on any standard Kubernetes conformant cluster, right?
Yep. So OpenShift, TKG, Rancher, yeah. Any Kubernetes conformant cluster. Yep. And something I should also mention, Velero will also work on managed Kubernetes clusters. So it backs up things through the Kubernetes API. It doesn't grab etcd directly. So like if you're on GKE or EKS or anything like that, you don't get access to etcd directly. So that's why we work through the API server. So it'll work even on, managed.
Oh, okay.
Solutions.
Yeah.
That there's some issues with that because things could be changing in the API server while the backup's running. And we've talked in the data protection working group about maybe introducing some sort of freeze API. But that's probably down the road and requires upstream Kubernetes changes. But
yeah,
for now, that's how Velero works.
All right.
And so I'm going to do this Velero command. Varies like what we talked about. I'm naming it WP-demo, including this namespace WordPress. And I'm just going to wait for it to complete. All right. And the way that works is we just fire off a custom resource to the Kubernetes API server and let our controller/operator run against it. And we'll clear the screen so it's not all at the bottom. And we're going to do a describe against it to see what all's there. So I'm going to scroll up here. All right, so the name is what we named it, WP Demo. Velero puts all its backspaces, or I'm sorry, backups in the Velero namespace. It does not store it in the same namespace as the application, because what if you accidentally delete that namespace and you want to get it back?
Right.
It's we've had requests to change it, and we're open to that. We just need to figure out that problem. Like if you accidentally delete that namespace, you need a way to get it back. Um,
Yeah.
so we're not completely married to that design. We just need to figure out a solution to that problem.
Yeah. Like maybe a parallel namespace that's named
Right.
Velero. Name. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. We duplicate it or something like that. But for now, it either goes in the default namespace is Velero. You can deploy it to whatever namespace you want. Um, we label everything with or we label every backup with the storage location, which is the object storage. There's a representation of the object storage bucket called a backup storage location, and this is just so we can easily fetch them from the API server.
Right.
In this case, it went to the default. There were no annotations on the backup, and it was completed. We've got some information on what stuff was included or excluded. So the namespace was WordPress, and we did not exclude anything. This is useful if you want to back up the whole cluster, but say exclude kube system, because usually there's a lot of stuff that's managed by the cluster that you might want to exclude because it's specific to the cluster, or that running cluster, I should say. Let's see here. We didn't apply a label selector to the backup, so we didn't grab stuff based on a label. Again, we stored it in the default location. We automatically snapshotted any persistent volumes. By default, the time to live or duration of a backup is a month, or 720 hours. There were no hooks defined on the backup itself. You can define hooks on the backup, or you can actually define a hook on a pod or a deployment, or anywhere you can put a pod template. So you can define a hook on your application to say dump my database, whether that be Mongo or MySQL or whatever your application uses. The backup format, this is the format that we store in object storage. We actually have some changes coming to this in 1.4 that are backwards compatible, so that it's going to be, I can talk about this more after the demo if you'd like, but we're going to take some longer term visions for the backup format. We've got some information on start and completed, and then just so you don't have to download the whole backup to see what's in it, we've got a resource list.
Cool. Yeah, that resource list is the money. That's where you're confirming all the objects that you expected.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then finally, this is what we snapshotted. So we've got these are what were created, and these IDs will vary based on your provider because different providers use different IDs. And I'm currently working on updating the values that will go here for the CSI plugins that we've written. So I've got a PR in progress to add this information for CSI snapshots. So now we're going to simulate a disaster or an accident, and we're just going to nuke the WordPress namespace.
Yeah.
Or before I do that, do you have any other questions?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're going to nuke it and then we're going to restore it. Is that what you're doing?
Yep.
Okay.
I'm going to nuke it, and I'll also run to the website and show that no, really, it's gone. So this should be busted. Yep. Should start getting a 404 soon. It's deleted. Yep, nothing there. So just to show I'm not pulling anything, site's really gone. I'm refreshing, not getting anything back. And to confirm even further, nothing found. There's nothing on the Kubernetes server.
All right. Nothing up your sleeves. Nothing up your sleeves.
Nope. No persistent volumes on the cluster anymore either. That's only stuff in this cluster was the WordPress stuff. It's WordPress. Contour was my ingress controller, which I think you talked to Steve Sloka, and Velero. And I probably should have cleared everything here, but we're going to create restore named wp-restore. And we're going to use from backup, we're going to use the wp-demo as the source for this restore. So again, what we're doing here is submitting a request, a custom resource to the Kubernetes API server. The Kubernetes API server will get it, and the Velero restore controller or operator will grab that, start the restore, and we're going to see that it will create all the namespaces and everything, and then things will start to run. So take a look at the restore details. We come up here. So of course, very similarly, the restore name and namespace, same as the backup. We've got the same name and the same namespace. No labels or annotations. And the namespaces here are a little different than the backup. We included all the namespaces that were in the backup because we don't know ahead of time what namespaces are in there. So we didn't do -- include namespaces, although we could on a restore. So you could selectively grab an individual namespace out of a restore or out of a backup, excuse me. So you could say, back up my whole cluster and then only grab one namespace out of it. So say I accidentally deleted this one namespace, you could go grab one namespace out of it if you wanted to. Or you could do a label selector out of the backup. And similarly, we included all resources except for nodes, because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to recreate nodes because that's all managed by the cluster itself. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to create nodes without actual hardware or virtual hardware standing behind it. Events are all short-lived, so we don't recreate those. They don't make a whole lot of sense to restore. And also, we don't restore our own backups and restores because we found restoring these actually causes some recursion. So if we restore backups, we kick off new backups. If we restore restores, we kick off new restores.
Yeah.
So Velero doesn't do that. And then restic repositories are for if we're doing file level backups, and Velero manages those outside of this backup restore cycle. So we don't restore those. We can also, if you'd like, do namespace remapping on restore. So you can say, take my WordPress namespace and rename it to something else, foobar,
Why would I need that?
You could do that if you wanted to clone a namespace. Say you wanted to take a production namespace, or you're playing around and you wanted to have a pristine copy of this namespace, but wanted to change something, and you weren't sure if it was going to work. You could copy that namespace with PVs and everything and mess around. So we've had users request this, and I honestly don't have statistics on how many people use this, but it's been a feature that people have definitely used. So it's something you can do and take your PV data along with you. If you do a namespace remapping, you can copy the PVs.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that is I think, especially in the storage realm, that's actually pretty normal. Like you can, like we
Hmm.
mentioned earlier, NetApp storage, like NetApp has an ability for you to take a snapshot and then essentially put it somewhere else so that someone can work on a read-only copy or something like that. So
Yep.
that totally makes sense to me, especially if you think about the work that it would be involved with someone like a DevOps team in order to spin up a new namespace that's identical to the current one so that someone
Hmm.
can see it. Like that's a lot of copying YAML and stuff versus just saying, "Hey, let's just restore to a new namespace." Yeah, that's pretty
Yep.
cool.
Yep. And there's similar work upstream. There's I'm not sure where the KEP is, but there's like a PV clone functionality that's coming. That's not a full namespace copy, but there's similar ideas
Okay.
in other realms. So, well, not making any commitments on changing, but we're definitely going to look at maybe using that functionality further on down the road
Yeah.
versus our own. But yeah, it's something that maybe in a CI/CD setup, you might want to use this to validate something with your app.
Cool.
All right, and then you can also use a flag to maybe you don't want to automatically restore PVs. You could set that to false and not restore PVs. You just want um, the Kubernetes metadata for some reason.
All
Okay,
right.
so after we've looked at that, take a look at the persistent volumes. So they're all back. We can look at the namespace and all of that stuff should be back. Got our service back. Got our pods back. We've got our replica set, our deployments. If I go back to my website, I've got my post. It's got both comments, including the one I made, and just prove it's still working. So everything is still running,
All right.
and that was the end of the demo. So, so yeah, the CRDs. Um, let's limit that just to show the Velero CRDs. This is what we've got in there that was installed, and there's a Velero install command. We've got two ways to install it with this Velero install command, which is shipped with the Velero client, so it's all built in, or with a Velero Helm chart.
Okay. Is there?
So we go
Sorry.
ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say either way, we support both ways.
Yeah.
And the Velero install command, we're currently revisiting it. It was meant to be like a quick start kind of tool, and then it's kind of grown into a little bit of a beast. To show you what I mean, if I do dash help, it's a very long list of options.
Right.
So we're looking at ways to fix this and make it much more friendly. So the Helm chart's one way of doing it, and we're also looking at replacing the Velero install command with Velero config command, because Velero install is kind of like a one and done thing.
Right. Not very
So
infrastructure as code friendly kind of thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you can do. It has a dash dash dry run, so you can dump out YAML and get your GitOps kind of thing from there. But yeah, it's not. That's not great. So we're looking at revisiting that and making it more useful for the infrastructure as code and GitOps, and maybe doing layering with I'm already blanking on customize. Um,
Yep.
doing customize and Helm. So, but right now our options are Velero install and uh, why am I blanking? Helm. So those are the two ways that we support for installing it at the moment, and of course doing the -f dry run to dump out the YAML that it produces.
Can you do that same dry run on a backup job so you can produce YAML that you could apply rather than doing the Velero the backup command? You know?
Yeah. If I say include namespaces WordPress and I do -- dry run. Oop. What did I get wrong? Oh, and actually I think it's actually just -o YAML, but I
unknown
need
flag
backup.
include namespaces.
Yeah, it was backup
Create.
creates.
Yeah, there you go.
And yeah, so if it's just -o YAML.
Nice.
So yeah, the install command is kind of janky. I say that as the person who wrote it. So yeah, you can do the -o YAML. There's also the Velero schedule command, which my sched, and that takes all the same arguments as a backup, including a cron job specification. So let's see. So if I say namespaces WordPress, and I'm gonna forget where the cron jobs space is, and
then you have to schedule in there. Yeah.
yeah, I couldn't remember what the name was. And now let's do 8. Is it 5? There we go. So a schedule would look like this. So it's got a backup template right there, and then when you do restore, you can do a -- from schedule, and if you do -- from schedule on a restore, it will grab the latest backup created from that schedule and restore from that.
Okay. And this schedule is it's one of your API resources. Okay.
Yep. It's one of the custom resource types.
Yeah. So it acts like a cron job, but it's not actually using the jobs or any of the cron job, the default resources. It's a custom resource. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a custom resource, and we have our own custom operator for it. We've looked into making it use the cron job, but we haven't prioritized that in our backlog yet.
That's probably nice to keep regular application stuff separate from your actual backup stuff. So, if it has the same features, I don't see like why that's at least for me, I'd be fine with it being its own. But we have a question actually from the chat.
Sure.
Is there some form of scheduled job that can be deployed to a K8s cluster that would simulate the backup and restore periodically to ensure that the backup and restore process is monitored?
Yeah, so we include Prometheus metrics, but in terms of restores, we don't have a schedule for restores. So right now, that needs to be done separately. So you need to include your own. I can stop sharing at this point if you'd like.
Sure.
I don't really have anything more unless we need to look at something specific.
Yeah, but I mean, backup. That's a good question around backup monitoring, and then which are almost really two separate things, right? Backup monitoring, and then DR and just recovery validation is always a challenge for every team. So let's talk about monitoring for a minute. So what's going on there?
So there's two things we advise. We've got Prometheus metrics exposed. We don't ship a whole lot of stuff to set up Prometheus, mostly because that's kind of outside the scope. But we do ship out Prometheus metrics, like last time a backup job failed, last time a backup job finished. You can also query for the latest backup job, like watch the endpoints and grab that information. In terms of validating restores, that is something we don't provide like I said, we don't provide a schedule that's equivalent to a backup.
Right.
And we also don't want to just like overwrite. We don't want to just apply to your clusters. So
Right.
you're probably going to want to come up with some strategy that applies it to some test cluster.
I was
That
sitting here thinking, like, as you were talking, I was thinking that I was like, it almost needs to be like a custom add-in that basically pushes your backups to a separate place that has no way to affect production, and then does a real one, and then validates, and then you have to have application validation to make sure that the app's actually restored correctly. So that's a
yeah,
separate
it's
product.
right. That's tough. The closest I can think of to get in a generic way is to do comparisons on your YAML.
Yeah.
And even then there's Kate's metadata like UIDs and creation timestamps and things like that that's just not valid in the comparison.
Yeah. So you got to
So
strip that
creation
out. Yeah.
timestamps you have to rip out. Like we rip that out on restore because it's not useful. So that is tough. There's some internal projects we have that are not ready to ship out that have tried that, but they're kind of half baked in POCs. And we're also talking about for our 1.5 release timeframe to get some more end-to-end testing on our public CI to start playing with this, and maybe that gets elevated into part of the project, but mostly it'll be to validate some like major bug regression testing.
Yeah. Okay. The last thing I can think of is, it sounds like it's in scope that if I lose my entire cluster, that this can provide me a mechanism to bring the whole thing back to life.
Yep. Yeah. So the kind of the big brain vision would be to use this in cluster API to treat your clusters as cattle. So if you think about this as like, even if, let's say you don't want to upgrade your clusters in place,
Right.
just spin up a new version of Kubernetes with cluster API, use this to move it, kill the old clusters. And maybe you use some higher level load balancer, Contour, Gimbal, or some other thing to move your traffic over. Once it's
Right.
all there, then you kill the old one. So yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
So this is providing the, after a default install, and assuming that you've installed Velero, installed meaning, added it to the cluster, whatever.
Yep.
Then ideally it's providing from one cluster a command, or I guess, because you're doing it cross cluster.
Mm-hmm.
So how does the new cluster even know about the old cluster's backups? Is that something that's built in?
So
Can you
yeah, so what
can you
you
do
have to
cross cluster
do,
restores? Is that a feature? I guess I'm asking the same question.
absolutely. So the way that works, that's actually in our documentation. That's a big use case. Is essentially the way you get that cross cluster restore is you install Velero. So you have to spin up the cluster, get the Velero deployment running, and you have to make sure that Velero deployment points to the same bucket, that same object store bucket that the previous cluster backed up to. So once they're both pointing to the same bucket, then you can restore from that previous cluster.
Okay.
So you have cluster A write to your bucket, and then you have cluster B read from that bucket, and then you can get that cross cluster migration.
Yeah. All right. Let's do it. All
Yeah.
right. Well, I mean, it's funny. This is all like, I'm realizing we basically just created a tutorial and an intro to like backups on Kubernetes, because I think it's a big question. And as I kind of admitted in some of my social posts, that I'm part of the problem, because I do training all the time. I'm teaching people on the internet, and I don't talk about backups a lot. Like I just, it's one of those topics that people don't buy courses on. People don't, they want it, the backup part is something they do after they've already learned everything else, right? And so in fact, I'm now thinking about it, that like the number of questions in my courses out of 170,000 people that have asked about backup questions is really, really small. Like probably just a couple of handfuls of
Mm-hmm.
people. And I don't think it's because we all just don't care.
Right.
I think there's just multiple reasons. Like you said, some people, my advice to most people usually is avoid persistent data in your cluster if at all possible, right? Like if you can just use the cloud's data provisioning services for like RDS or whatever, do that.
Sure.
Avoid, the easiest Kubernetes cluster is the one that can go away and that you can rebuild it from manifests and it's fine. And you don't have to restore data. Like, yeah, it would be nice if we all just never had to worry about having Velero, and we could just we could just have a deployment of infrastructure as code, and the cluster comes back up, and connections start happening, and then we let the cloud worry about the persistent data. But the reality is that everything's complex, more complex than that. We all have legacy apps, and yeah. So all right,
yeah, and there's I forget. I think it was Twitter. Somebody did a KubeCon. I believe it's KubeCon Seattle. They talked about using Velero to do backups, and they were playing around with Kubernetes and did an accidental command that just deleted all their clusters. And they were like, "We didn't think we needed this," and then we deleted everything. So it's an afterthought, and it's one that we've heard from customers is like, "Oh yeah, it was always a later, and then they deleted stuff, and now it's we need this." So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we thought we didn't have persistent data, but it turns out that we actually changed things in Kubernetes, and we needed that persistent. Yeah. So.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a valid reason for moving everything to as much infrastructure as code and GitOps, and remove the command line from remove the API connections from anyone's local machine, and only allow the automation bots to do that. And that, I mean, it's a hard thing, and most of the teams I work with don't ever get that to that level, just because there's a lot of things that have to go into that sort of bite you in the rear if you don't really have a strong automated pipeline. But that's for another podcast.
Yeah.
We have a couple more questions.
Sure.
One is, so do you recommend just doing manual restore testing regularly then, I guess, since there is no automated?
Yeah, at this point, I would recommend that. I would strongly recommend working to automate that, and that's something we're working on internally. It's something we want to get to. We also have community meetings on Tuesdays at noon Eastern. If folks want to discuss like approaches to that, that's absolutely a valid topic. If folks want to discuss how they might approach that and share that information, absolutely a valid thing. If users want to share what they've tried, that would be great to hear. One thing I will say as a developer of Velero, a lot of my clusters don't live very long.
Right.
So that would be great to get some insight from folks who have clusters that live a lot longer than me, or a lot longer than mine. So I would definitely welcome feedback and user experience there. And so, yeah, we've got discussions on Slack channel. So I would recommend testing your restores, whether they're manual or automated, as much as you can at this point. Just because the backups are good, but if you try to restore and they don't work, then that's just as bad as not having backups.
Yeah, and there's stuff that's, I mean, to me, most of the headaches have nothing to do with the backup tool. Like the restore of a backup may be fantastic, but the application didn't write to disk properly, so I don't actually have valid data backups, or my connections come into different endpoints, and those endpoints were lost and restored, and I didn't update those things. So like, there's so many things there that I mean, nothing. I used to have an old boss that would basically walk in on some Friday where there wasn't a lot going on. He would say, "Okay, everybody in the conference room," and we all kind of knew what that meant, because he was going to say, "Today is DR day. Imagine the data center is gone. How do we start restoring the data center?" And we would have the DBA team, we'd have everybody essentially all hands on deck saying, "Okay, let's go through this exercise." And it was basically a shit show. It was always scrambling to try to figure out all the things in all the teams. And we realized no matter how much documentation we had, there was always a gap. There was always some exception, because since the last time we did it, new stuff showed up.
Something new.
Yeah.
It's like playing Chaos Monkey.
Yep. With a bunch of humans. A Chaos Monkey of manual activities. Yeah. So I don't think there's such a thing as too much backup testing, especially if you're someone who's responsible for backups, because I think a lot of organizations just assume that the backup person or the team responsible for that might be the same as the storage team, that they're somehow like magically able to test all these apps, and they're usually not. Like they're not the developers, they're not the operators, so they don't necessarily have the capability to even know if the app's going to work if they restore it. So yeah, that's a hard thing, and I sympathize for those people because they're usually the most relied on in the situation, but they're usually the ones that have the least amount of information about how the apps are supposed to work and all the other things outside of that, like networking that usually needs to be involved as well. Yeah.
Or even your cloud vendor. Like if you think about it, if Amazon or Google Cloud or Azure go down, like their concern isn't necessarily your app. It's getting their infrastructure back. Now, they have a huge incentive to get back online, that's for sure. But like their incentive is not your application. So like a lot of that does fall on your organization's shoulders. So owning your uptime, I think a lot of people say that, but it's hard to do. It's expensive and it's hard.
Yeah, and it's not immediately effective. It's like if the failure never happens, then no one ever got to see all your work. So
right, yeah, that's a lot of time and effort spent for something that hopefully never happens.
Right. Which is why it often gets pushed to the back of the project, right? Because all the project delays are happening, and everyone's like, "Well, we'll just do the DR testing later then." So, yeah. Well, this has been a great discussion. Thank you all for the questions. Hopefully, we'll have more to talk about in the future about backups and DR, and when you guys get some major new features, it'd be great to have you back on the show to get a catch up to this. But for those of you out there, the message is try this stuff, do the right thing. Like, don't let it be that one day that you suddenly, because sometimes jobs depend on this, and it's important. So we'll do better on our end talking about it. You do your better on your end of actually using it. So thanks a lot, Nolan, for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
People can find you at the little Twitter handles on our little page there. You can get Velero at velero.io, and there's also a Twitter handle, right? I think it's Velero Project.
Project Velero?
Or Project Velero. So you can follow them on Twitter and see their releases.
Yeah, we're also on the Kubernetes Slack in the Velero channel.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
I just checked yesterday, by the way, that they're about to cross over 100,000 members in Kubernetes Slack.
Yeah. So I'm actually kind of surprised they're not over already.
Yeah. It's absolutely the biggest one in the world. Like, it's crazy.
Yeah.
But the Golang one is almost 50,000. I think we just checked the other day, and they're pretty huge too.
Nice.
But yeah, 100,000. Crazy.
Yep.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for being on live and asking questions. We will be back here. We actually won't be here next week. Next week we'll be off. I'm actually going to be doing Kubernetes workshops all day live over the internet to some private customers, but have fun on the internet. There's going to be live stuff on the internet next week anyway, so go find that stuff. Like you mentioned earlier, there's the Kubernetes Fridays every Friday on YouTube. You can just search for that. It's under VMware account. And we'll be back here in a couple of weeks talking more about all this Kubernetes and Docker stuff, as well as prepping you, getting ready for the DockerCon Live event later next month. And we'll see you again. Thanks.
Bye.